Welcome to another episode of The Shift with Elena Agar. In this conversation, I speak with Kimberly Benoit. She's a leadership development coach. She works with organizations as well as individuals. We talked about leadership quite a bit in this chat and just really the importance of giving continuous feedback for growth that you can benefit from as a leader, but it's also your team. In addition to that, we talked about the importance of self-awareness and being authentic and just genuine in your leadership role. Self-awareness is probably one of the biggest skills a leader can have, and it's an ongoing journey. We also talked about this blurring line between personal life and work, and how can you as a leader or just any professional in today's day and age maintain that and manage that, the both sides of the spectrum. So if you're in a leadership role, or maybe you're just thinking about going into one, or just thinking of where you can do better, this episode is definitely for you. So check it out. As always, comment, leave reviews, sign up, and hit the like button. It really helps the reach. I appreciate it, and come back for more. Kimberly, welcome to the Shift Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy for us to be here too, because I love your tagline that you use, which is the we've done it all realization. Where does
Yes.
that come from?
Well, it was the realization that I have done some things as a leader that I'm not proud of. I tell this story in my book. I was having dinner, drinks with a friend, and we were talking about leaders that we knew and had worked for, that we thought were good people, but their leadership sucked. Like we thought that they were terrible at holding people accountable, or there was a lot of nepotism. And so we're just talking about how toxic they were. And I like to joke, I want to say maybe it was after glass two, when I had kind of this lightning bolt moment of, I wonder how many people who've worked for me have had this conversation about me.
Oh yeah.
And very quickly, faces came to mind of people I know who had worked for me, who just hated me or thought I was a terrible leader, or um yeah. And I immediately thought, oh yeah, there's people talking about me the same way. And then I found myself thinking, but there's reasons why I did what I did, and so immediately became defensive, like, oh, but I'm not like these people I'm talking about. I'm different. Like, there was a different story. And so it kind of led into, we joked about it. And then, like, over the coming days and weeks, I kind of sat there and thought about that, of like, how quick are we to point the finger at someone else for being a crappy leader, a toxic leader. But how rarely we ever really deep dive and look at ourselves to say, are we doing it too?
Mm,
Even if
yeah,
it's unintentional, are
right.
we doing it too?
And it's just speaking, like we probably are. We just don't realize that. I don't think there is a perfect leader. I mean, I've had some great managers, and even they had their days. I have my days on probably monthly basis, if not weekly.
Well, and I think it's the thing of, and this is part of what why I did this was, sometimes I think we get labeled toxic by someone. And the truth is, we never intended to be a bad leader. Like, it's almost this weird, like, good versus evil of, like, they're a bad leader because they want to destroy my life. They just don't like me. These narratives we create, versus sometimes there's real other stuff going on. And what that person is doing has really nothing to do with you, or it was unintentional. Like, they had great intention, but the execution was lacking.
Hmm.
And I know for myself, like, there's moments that I can think of right now where I had great intention, my execution really sucked. And so for that person, it was not a good experience. Unfortunately for me, you can't do it over. This isn't like, we can't magically wave a wand and say, can I get a mulligan? Can I do that over? It's important for sometimes, unfortunately, our mistakes are what color how we have to learn and how others think about us.
Yeah. Well, depending on a mistake, I guess, but
Yeah.
yeah, but it's no, it's interesting because there's this notion also that you leave all your baggage at home type thing. So if you're because sometimes there is something going on and sometimes it's outside of work. And even as
Yeah.
leaders, everything we forget, we think just because somebody's in a certain position, they're all of a sudden immune to everything else that happens in life and other parts of life outside of work. But do you as a leader, is there an expectation that we should turn that off and come into work like, listen, like leave everything behind and come into work? Is that a realistic expectation, you think? Or do
No.
we bring all of that with, or how does that, where's the balance?
So I think there's been a huge shift.
Mm-hmm.
And I think COVID was a part of that. So I joke that before COVID, you could really attempt to have two selves, your work self and your home self. Leaders basically had their styles, and you needed to adjust your work style to your leader style. I would say during COVID, that shifted completely because when you're working from home and your kids are back there or your family's back there, suddenly life blurred in a very interesting way. And it was no more of a work self and a home self. And I think we have further moved into that now. I think it's completely unrealistic to tell people you need to forget your stuff at home. I think that's completely unrealistic. I don't know any person, even in a leadership position, that doesn't bring some of their stuff with them too. Um, I think where we have to be careful is also respecting people are willing. You can't expect people to tell you everything about what's happening with them. They have a right to privacy. So if they don't want to tell you what's happening, they don't have to. But no, I think in general, like having that expectation is completely unrealistic. People need to be able to show up as their authentic selves because I think that's when we have the most engaged, productive teams is when they feel accepted and understood completely.
Mm. I'm curious in the work that you do with leaders now, or with companies in particular,
Yeah.
when companies reach out to you, I often see that companies will reach out and they'll be like, we need a leadership training. And the leadership training is about motivating other people and yada yada. It's all about it's how can we be great leaders for others and how do we work with other people? But it seems like there's a big missing piece of self-awareness, which I feel like in leadership, like if you focus on anything, it should just be self-awareness. Because I think, in my opinion, most people are not as self-aware as they should be or can be, myself included. I always ask myself, like, what else am I not seeing today about myself that I probably should? I learned the hard
Yeah.
way. But I really think there's a big gap in self-awareness in general, especially at a leadership level. So when companies reach out to you, like what do you see is there a shift towards like, hey, like maybe our leaders need some self-awareness training before we go into all these things, or is it still typically that, or do you push back on that?
I think so. First and foremost, I think when you have companies that are reaching out to consultants and people like you and I to come in to address their teams or to address the gap, I think there is a lot of good intention. My fear always has been is when a call comes in and says, "Hey, we're having trouble with this team, or we have communication issues. Can you come do a communication training?" Um, that sometimes what they're asking you to solve is a symptom, not the problem. And so you and I can go in there and we can customize a training. We can do all this amazing stuff. But going back to your question is sometimes there's a lack of self-awareness about what's the real problem.
Mhm.
What you're asking me to come train on, um, like trust or whatever, that's a big one. So if you say trust, so my first question would be is where does the trust start and stop? Right. So is it the C-suite? Like, because that's usually what happens, right? The C-suite is saying we have a problem, come train these people. Awesome. Well, what about you? Like, where do you fit in this? Because unfortunately, I've seen that happen with a lot of organizations. Is there's training requirements pushed down from middle management to like to frontline,
Mhm.
and then but nothing changes at the top. And so when you think about behavior is going to follow what's rewarded. And if you're saying training for you, for thee, but not for me, like,
Mhm.
but that behavior isn't modeled or rewarded at a higher level, then you're never actually fixing that problem. So I think it's two things to your point. I think that sometimes there's not true awareness around what's the real issue driving the behavior. And two, everybody's got to participate in the new behavior in order for it to become part of the culture. Otherwise, you're just spending money and spinning wheels, and then saying, "Oh, look, we just spent money on that consultant and it didn't work." It's like, well, no,
Yeah.
because we didn't actually address the real problem.
Yeah, just put a band-aid on a broken leg.
Pretty much. I mean, and it's hard. I think it's going back to the whole story of how I started this, is it's really difficult to sit back and say, I'm not doing this well. Um, particularly if you've been reinforced in certain ways and moved into leadership positions, to turn around and then say, okay, where am I not showing up the way I want to? Where am I not delivering the leadership that my team deserves? It's very, very hard for a lot of people to take those kind of hits because it feels so personal.
Mhm.
But to your point, you have to ask those questions, because otherwise you're never going to grow as a leader and become better, stronger, to progress in your own career.
Yeah, I think it's almost harder not to ask those questions because if it's hard for you, then you know that this is the work that you need to do, and then you're just neglecting it, and it doesn't get any easier. It's like the more set in with our ways, the more senior we grow. Like if we're not creating space to ask ourselves those questions or to be
Yeah.
brutally honest, I think it's like I always say feedback is a privilege, and I think starting with ourselves, like that self-awareness, because otherwise it's very difficult to it's hard to maybe ask the right questions, I would imagine. I'm just thinking to myself, like, what's hard, But I think it's not hard to pause and be like, I could probably be a better leader because I think everybody can. But then
Yeah.
it's like, I think we're not doing ourselves service if we're just neglecting it. But to your point, yes, I've also worked with leaders who are, senior in their, careers and build these successful businesses and so on, but something is not working. So it's like, sooner or later, I think you come to realization that like you're going to be forced into thinking about like what can you do differently, either by force or being proactive. And I'd always recommend being proactive.
Well, and I think part of it too is when you get feedback, it matters where it comes from, right? So if
Yes,
you feel like you're getting feedback from somebody you don't trust, you're going to have confirmation bias. And you're going to
true.
say, well, of course someone would say that. I bet this so and so said that about me because they just don't like me. And
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons I really like, and I know there's a lot of different versions out there, but there's one that and I'm not going to endorse one specifically, but I there was a company that I used to work for, and what I loved about it was we did a 360. And it was an internally built tool, and so I basically gave a list of people I wanted to give feedback. So my leader picked some people, and I picked some people, and all the information that came back was completely masked. I had no clue who said what, and even the way that they gave quotes, I really couldn't tell who said what.
Mm.
And so there wasn't any opportunity for me to say, well, that was just someone who didn't like me, because I picked half of the respondents. I kind
Yeah.
of, you're stacking the deck, right?
Yeah.
But not necessarily. But you're basically picking people that you had a good working relationship with. So if they came back and said your communication needs work or you're conflict avoidant, well, that had to come from somebody that you trust, that you've worked with, that you have a good relationship with. So I encourage people when we're doing feedback and because I know we do mid-years and I know we do annuals. I wish we would incorporate those components in there where not just what the leader sees, but also give me a list of people you worked with. I'm going to send out this survey that's going to be blind coming back so that you can have a more holistic view of what is going well and what isn't.
Mhm.
Because I think, wouldn't you agree, if it's somebody you know and trust who came to you and said, hey, here's something I think you should work on, I think this is a blind spot you have, you're
Mhm.
going to feel way more comfortable about that than if it's somebody you might not have the best working relationship with, who's like, you really need to go work on that.
Yeah.
How you are going to respond is going to be totally different.
Yeah. But then I'll be a little bit upset if they didn't tell me sooner. Like, why do you wait till mid-review and annual review? But that's a whole other conversation. Yeah, it's like because it's
Well,
hard
and
to
it's
give
like, how do
feedback,
we
right?
ask for feedback from people in general?
Yeah.
Is it upon us to reach out to people we trust and create the space to say, hey, I'm really trying to work on myself. I know I have blind spots. I trust your feedback.
Yeah.
Would you tell me if there's something I'm not doing well, or I could just do better? Not that you have to suck at it, but
Yeah.
can I do something better? Would you feel comfortable telling me? We have to create the foundation for people to tell us and not be fearful that we're going to be resentful or that we're going to retaliate in some way. You've got to open the door for them to give it to you. Do you
Yeah.
know does that make
Yeah.
sense?
No, absolutely. And I'm just thinking, how much money organizations could save if they would just be able to implement that instead of hiring external consultants to go in and do 360s instead of just
Yeah.
embedding this as part of the culture from day one, that feedback is, You know what I mean? A continuous. There was a company, I
Yeah.
think, I forget which company. There's a couple that come to mind, but I'm not gonna call them out in case I'm wrong. But I don't want to give them credit if it's not due there, but that's basically what I'm saying. But they have this feedback. What is it called? Like oh my God. Anyway, it's like basically like almost like a weekly, daily, oh, anytime feedback. That's what it was. It was like anytime feedback, and I guess it's part of like Workday tool that you can do this, and people can actually like just randomly you can send like, let's say you and I worked on a project, and I'll email you right after the project. I'm like, hey Kimberly, like, can you give me feedback on this project? Like, and it can be anonymous, or you can ask a direct person. It's up to you. You can send it to the
Interesting.
whole group, and it's called anytime feedback. I'm not sure like how much they use it and how active it is. But when I heard this lady speak about it, I thought that's pretty good, because it's like it doesn't rely, because I think when you do continuous anytime feedback, it allows for more effective conversation at that at that annual. And you're not surprised and you're not so soul crushed when all that bad feedback comes your way. You
So
know what
it's
I mean?
interesting. So I worked for a company, which I'm not going to name because I don't even know if they still do this because I
Yeah.
worked there a long time ago. And they termed it free feedback friendly environment. And when I started working there, they said, "Hey, just be aware, you're going to get a lot of feedback every single day."
Hmm.
And I was like, "Okay, not sure what that meant." And then I got bombarded, like everything from I counted one day and I want to say I got like 20 pieces of feedback.
Oh my God.
And it was like everything from, hey, you did a great job opening that presentation. Hey, do you realize you have a typo and a formatting issue on slide 20 of that presentation you just did? Hey, your executive presence really has improved. I just want you to know that. But it was like, it wasn't all big things, but it was a continual thing. And it came from my team. It came from leaders across the floor. And so after like being incredibly overwhelmed, I actually talked to somebody because they had a very structured mentor program. So I had a peer mentor assigned to me. And I was like, is this like this all the time? And he said, yes.
Oh
And I
my
said,
God.
oh my God, I don't think I'm going to make it. Because I'm just like, this is a lot, like in just managing your own stress and your own anxieties. And he said, no, he said, you got to think about it this way. We are only as strong as our weakest link. And if we are able in a safe environment to help you get stronger every single day, then that means we become a stronger team every single day. Because it's not about tearing you down. It's about like, because it was things I had done really well. It was things that they knew I was working, like I was improving on. So, like, I had gotten feedback and they were commenting that they could see the growth and change. Um, Basic skill things of like, hey, I can see you probably don't know how to use Excel super well. Let me help you
Yeah.
here. That kind of thing. But I mean, and it was the craziest thing because over time I became very dependent on it.
Yeah.
And I kept it so that when it came around to mid-year and when it came around to annual, I actually had a paper trail of things that I had worked on, things that people commented on. And so it wasn't like this nebulous thing where I'm sitting there a week before it's due saying, oh crap, like what do I put here? Um, because I like that was one of the things they encouraged you to do because it helped you understand how you were growing
Mm-hmm.
and developing. When I left that organization, it was a huge weird thing when I went to my next company because I didn't realize how dependent I had become on people helping me identify what I was doing well, and also where I wasn't showing up the way I could.
Mm.
Um, and so because the feedback was so constant of like,
Yeah.
hey, you kind of came across short in this meeting. Did you mean when you said this, did you mean that way? Like, because this is how it came out. But I
Yeah.
think you meant this. Like, is that what you meant? So it gave me a chance to course correct to your point in the moment versus waiting and letting something simmer somewhere uncomfortably for a while.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know. But what I would say is for that to exist, you have to have so much trust. And that
Yeah.
goes back to the thing I said before is we have to create that fertile ground that when I come to you with positive feedback, constructive feedback, that um, it's coming from a good place. It's not coming from a place of trying to tear you down, but it's coming from a place of trying to build you up. And I think that requires trust.
Mm-hmm.
And in organizations that are struggling, that's going to be really hard to come by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if I can handle that. Not because I'm a huge fan of feedback, but I'd just be
Yeah.
annoyed. I'd be like, dang, like okay, tell me in a week. Like that, like let me work. Like that would be my mindset. Like if I just bombarded by like every little thing, because I'm also my own worst critic. So also like I think for somebody like me, it will probably I mean, I can see how you have to have a real mindset to be like, okay, this is gonna make me great.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it sounds exhausting.
Well, but there were people that you started to realize like looked for things. So, like for instance,
Yeah.
because I knew this person was a stickler for formatting, anytime I had a presentation, I would reach out to them proactively and say, "Hey, I have a presentation coming up. Can I show you my slides?"
Yeah.
So that way you're not like it's not like delayed feedback. It also changes your mindset of how you ask for help, how you lean on people who have strengths that are different than yours. Like if I had a big presentation, there was someone who every single time would give me feedback every single time that I use my hands too much. I told him I'm Southern. That's just what we do. And but he also was very adamant that sometimes it was distracting. So if I had an important presentation to give, I would make him sit and practice with me so that if I used my hands, it was at a point to emphasize a specific issue and not to draw. So how did I practice, like knowing I do it now? How do I do it in a way that drives the presentation forward, not distracts from it? So it
Hmm.
ended up being something very different. Whereas in the beginning, it was overwhelming. I started then to take it and use it in a more proactive fashion,
Hmm.
which again helped me show up as a better professional, a better leader, a better teammate.
Yeah.
And I would say that happened universally. But again, it was an adjustment. Let me be very clear. It was not, it was a weird adjustment. Um, but when you started to shift your mindset of how you could leverage that information, it completely opens you to a different
Hmm.
capacity professionally.
Yeah. That's interesting because like when I was doing like stage presence coach, like I was working with a stage presence coach, and there were certain things, and when I've done like the TEDx and like other talks, and there's certain criteria that you have to follow. And for me personally, I think a lot of people can relate to it, is that where is the fine line between you being your authentic self and how you, because I also speak with my hands, if you start to tone me down, I'm like a
Yeah.
robot. Then I'm so conscious around like my hands, and it's like you tie me together. Then I'm not
Yeah.
being myself. And it's like, at what point is the feedback is like, thanks, but I'm not gonna take it because I'm self-aware enough to know that actually I'm doing this
Yeah.
because this is what speaks to me. So I'm also curious, like how, and then we'll move on from that. But I find it really interesting because it's so valuable, and it's like, do you take all the feedback? But to your point, like people start picking, like, and what if your job is not to be a presenter? Like, for example, like I'm not great at presentation, but you know who is my graphic designer? I'll let her worry about the presentation. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, at what point do you like, I don't need to do everything perfect. Like, I have other people that can do it for you. Know what I mean?
Well, and I think that's the thing so did I take every piece of feedback? I listened to it and I was always grateful when someone offered it. Um, because again, that takes courage to tell somebody that
Yeah.
and again, not all the feedback was negative. So,
Right.
because I think when we think of feedback, we often think it's negative. And the truth of it is that wasn't the case. I would say 50% of the time it was positive.
Mm.
And so going back to the example of talking with my hands, I knew I did it. I knew that I had received feedback from other people that sometimes it distracted them. So that is why I said, okay, this is who I am. I'm not going to be able to stop myself. Like, clearly, I can't. I've hit a certain age, doubt it's going to change. And so what I did decide to do though was say, is there what are some tactics for me to do something with my hands at moments I don't want it to be a distraction? Right. So again, it goes back to how am I driving? How do I take the feedback to leverage it to drive my message forward versus distract from the message? So, for instance, one of the things I found, I don't use my hands as much if I have something in them. So, if I have a clicker in my hand, I'm not as inclined to use this hand in some drastic way. And so it was little things for me because I knew if I wanted to progress professionally, I continue to speak and do a lot of things, that if the message is coming from more than one person and you're getting a trend. So this is another thing we can talk about because you're like sometimes leaders have one bad day. Yes. But if the information continues to show up and there's a trend forming, that it's not a one-time thing, that it's not just one person who thinks this or feels this, then probably it's something you need to think about. Not to say that you have to become a completely different person, but how do I be myself informed by this information that maybe I need to make some adjustments? And to your point, maybe the final idea is I'm not the right person to be on stage.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I don't deliver the message the best. Maybe there's someone else on my team who should. So those kinds of things. It's how do you use that information to inform you in what you do next?
Mm. And when we talk about developing that trust and uniting teams, what are the practical steps? Like what organizations do it well? Like what does that look like? And when there's no trust, what does that look like?
Well, I mean, I think no trust is pretty easy. I mean, those are usually the teams that you tend to have very low engagement, high turnover. They constantly feel like somebody's gunning for them. Somebody's trying to stab them in the back. I mean, they don't feel like their leaders know them, care about them. I mean, those are pretty extreme like things, but I think you see that happen all the time. And unfortunately, good companies can start to squander with one leader coming in, creating a not so safe environment. I think so when you talk about practical things that teams can do, I think it comes down to one, I think it has to be accountability. So when you think about it from like most people think about trust from an individual standpoint, but if you're a leader and you're trying to develop a culture of trust and respect, one of the first places to start is, are we all being held accountable to the same standard? And how are we communicating clearly across what the standards are? What are the consequences if we're not able to meet them, so that people start to identify no one is special and no one is different than the other person.
Hmm.
So you probably wouldn't think that's where it starts, but if you start to really think about like, we all have each other's backs, we're all on a level playing field, we're all here. And part of that accountability is like, how are you showing up as a team member? How do you support the team, not just yourself? So there's a lot of things that tie into that. But I think accountability is a huge component. If people don't feel they're all playing on the same field, or there's different standards for different people that they don't understand why, and that's usually where people start to feel like there's favorites, that'll kill trust instantly. So I always start to talk with is accountability consistent across your team? And is it communicated clearly of what it means to be accountable and to be a good team member within that culture?
You know what I'm starting to see, the trends that I'm starting to see in our workplace is that oftentimes at home, we do keep, like in a relationship, right, in our family, we keep people accountable, it feels like, at least like in some of the relationships that I see around me, some of the families. But it's like when we get to work, we almost forget that the humans we work with also require relationships. Like these are relationships just like you have at home, and different, but in terms of like they're just human beings.
Yeah.
But it's I always joke and I say, you know, we spend so much time project management managing a project for our job, but then we're such a hot mess at home. And it's like you have the same skills, you have the same tools in your toolbox. You don't just leave it when you leave your house and when you leave work. Like you're literally the same person. Why can't you just apply that to, you know, it's almost like shouldn't it be common sense? Maybe not, but like what is the disconnect, you think? Because to me, it's like that's part of being human, right?
Yeah.
Like so just your thoughts on it.
It's so funny. So I think that, well, first, there's a thought that came to mind that I don't want to lose, is one of the things is to build trust with people is how present are you with them? So for instance, because one of the quickest ways to kill trust and engagement within a team is if people don't feel like you are 100% present with them and you are fully engaged with them. So I usually ask people, how often do you look at your Apple Watch or your cell phone when you're in a one-on-one with someone? How many times are you like multitasking and you're like, no, I hear you. But that also applies to home. You know, how many times are you doing something? It drives me nuts when I'm out and I see people at dinner and everybody's on a cell phone and not a single person's talking to each other. And maybe that's their like escape time, but it also comes down to how are we building trusting connected relationships, whether it's at home or at work, if we're not giving each other actual committed time to know who you are, know what's going on, what's going well, what's not going well, what do you need from me, what do I need from you. And again, these don't have to be like hour-long conversations, but they just need to be engaged moments. That could be a 20-minute conversation. But how are we showing up for each other, I think matters completely. And I think and I've been guilty of this, so I'm not going to sit here. Look, there is zero judgment. I want to be very clear to your listeners. I
Same
am not
here.
throwing stones every single thing I
Same.
have done. And then, but again, like that, and if you do it once, it's not a big deal. Like if you're
Yeah.
like, oh, I have to take this call, I'm so sorry. Once, not a big deal. But if you're doing it every single time you're with that person, you have communicated without ever saying a word. You are not important. My time is more valuable than your time. So
Mm-hmm.
you're just creating cracks and foundations. You may not mean to, but you absolutely are. And I think that also applies to home as well, is how do we invest in the people around us? And a lot of that has to do with our attention, which is
Yeah.
getting shorter and shorter, people.
Yeah.
So
It goes back to self-awareness, where it all lies in self-awareness, I feel, you know? No, I'm also on the team no judgment, because I mean, my partner, my family knows. Yeah, I've actually literally, like, I have like a theme that I put on like every year. And I think it was 2 years ago, mind you, I'm 38 now, so I was 36. So up until 36, it took me to be like, oh, maybe I should start paying more attention to my relationship. I was so work driven and I was so like hustle mode that I literally put a theme of relationships. And I've really invested that year. I mean, obviously, ever since then as well. But that was the year I started prioritizing relationships, personal relations, friendships, networks, like actual like family, because I've neglected it. And my friends have told me, they were kind enough to be like, hey, like, what's going on? You're not really here with us, type thing. And
see, there
it's
you go. Trusting relationship gave you feedback because they love you, care
yeah,
about you. Like there's a perfect example. You took
yeah,
it because it came from a safe space.
yeah. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, so it's hard to it's you neglect it, and I think
Yeah.
one of the things that I'm personally trying to get into more, go back to. I used to meditate quite a bit and like spend time in the morning. That usually helped me quite a bit to just be like to just think. And I've found myself getting so distracted. I wake up, I start watching the news, like or podcasts and stuff, or like go into work mode. And I never gave myself that chance. And I think like for anybody who's listening, I think that's also like a great thing to try is like, where can you be quiet? That's been a game changer for me.
So it's funny because you start your day that way. I usually try to find 5 to 10 minutes in the middle of the day
Mm.
because that's usually when you're like stuck in the grind and you're just the to-do list has gotten longer. What you thought you were going to get done today maybe has gotten completely derailed somewhere along the way. Something's broken, just I find that the middle of the day, and I usually try to do it around lunch because hopefully you're remembering to eat. And I find you should always be able to sneak 5 minutes.
Hmm.
And so I'm a big Insight Timer person. That's an app, by the way. It's free. And there's tons of 5 minute meditations where they
What's it
just
called?
remind you how to breathe.
What is it called?
Insight Timer.
Inside timer. Okay, I'm gonna look it
Yeah.
up.
And so there's like, and literally, it's just like we're going to take a deep breath together. So sometimes that's all we do is 5 minutes of somebody reminding me of how to breathe deeply, remind me to drop my shoulders. Can you feel like, where is there tension in your body? Keep breathing, and then amazingly within 5 minutes of just not having to think because someone's telling me what to do and it's solely focused on myself, so much calmer. So I like you're starting there. Usually I try to sneak it in midday because I
Yeah.
find I'm a nicer person after. Probably because I did some deep breathing. And it also stops the train of thought of
Yeah.
like wherever your mind might be going. It forces that pause, that
Yeah.
break.
Yeah.
So I'm a big believer in meditation. I believe it absolutely helps. And for anyone that hasn't tried it, no, you're not controlling your thoughts, but I think what it does is it helps you really become in tune with your body, which is a very different thing. And as a result, I think that's where your self-awareness can start too.
Mm-hmm.
It's because if you're aware that you're not taking deep breaths, if you're aware that your shoulders are up by your ears, then the next logical question is why am I so stressed? Right. And so you can start going down the five whys of like, well, why is this happening? Well, why do I feel that way? Well, it's and if you're not familiar with the five whys, it's actually a Six Sigma tool, but it's very practical to use in all
Super
aspects of
practical.
life.
Yeah.
Speaking of crossing over from work to home, but that's like, to me, I think that's a good first step of like gaining some awareness is, do you even know how your body feels right now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, no. A lot of
Yeah.
people would say they think so, but if you made them do that 5-minute breathing exercise, it's like, oh gosh. So again, so looking for practical things that people can do 5-minute breathing exercise.
Yeah.
And then ask yourself, how different, why do you feel different? Where do you feel different? Why do you feel different?
Mm.
Um, Again, it's all about that small baby steps of awareness.
Yeah, I love it. I'm gonna do 5 minutes after this before I have to go to my next meeting and then my next meeting and so on. Last question I ask all of my guests is, what is one question you wish people would ask themselves more often?
Hmm. I think we get so wrapped up sometimes in trying to, I think a lot of us are very self-critical, right? You are, I know I am, and I really hate when I fall short of who I want to be, or if I disappoint people, or particularly myself, if I didn't show up the way um that I wanted to. So what I would encourage people to do, because a lot of the work I do is in highlighting areas where people could be better. I would love for people to stop and say, what is one thing I'm incredibly proud of today? What is one thing I did that I did better than I thought I would do? Um, because I think again, we're so focused on the negative, is how can we kind of flip that a little bit and say, where did I make myself proud because I overdid. I did better than I thought I would. Um, just to kind of give ourselves a moment to kind of pat ourselves on the back for the work that we already are doing,
Mhm.
to show up as the better version of ourselves.
Beautiful. And where do you hang out at, Kimberly? Where can people get in touch with you?
I would say you can find me on LinkedIn, Kimberly J. Benoit, or you can go to my website, Kimberly J. Benoit. I have a newsletter, sign up. I try to only send the good stuff. So let me know. Come join me over there. And because there's some fun stuff coming in 2025. So can't wait to see you.
Awesome. I'm going to make sure to include all that in the show notes. Kimberly, thank you.